One of the first sections you'll see on your report will be the performance index calculations. And there are two sets for each term of the calculations. The first set will take all students in grades K through 8 and calculate an overall performance index, a reading performance index, and a mathematics performance index. A reminder that performance index is a measure of academic achievement, and it is weighted depending on the performance projection that the students achieve, with limited being the least weight and advanced being the highest weight. Below that are the performance index calculations with only 3rd through 8th grade that will better match the performance index calculations you would find on a local report card, the overall. The local report card does not divide those down into subject areas. Below that is the previous administration calculations and performance index. In the case of this report, we're looking back one full year to the previous fall. Those are your performance index for the same measures from 1 year earlier. When you receive the winter version of this report, those calculations will go back to the previous fall. So it'll be fall to winter and then fall to spring in the springtime. But this first one goes back to the previous year so that you can get a measure of the makeup of your student population as compared to 1 year earlier. The boxes with the performance indexes are color-coded based on the percent of the possible points earned. For example, in this case, they are all orange because this school, the students achieved at a level of 50 to 69% of the possible points earned. And a reminder that 120 is the most you can earn and 30 is the least. The arrows in the top simply represent whether you see an improvement or a decline in the performance index from the previous administration. Beside the performance index calculations, you'll see NCE calculations. NCE stands for the normal curve equivalent. It is often thought about like a percentile rank, but it is used for calculations of educational statistics. In using an NCE, the values are evenly distributed in a scale from 0 to 100 and keeps them at an equal interval so that these values can be averaged and compared from subject to subject and school to school more easily. One of the things that Buckeye Community Hope Foundation looks at with your contracts are the percent of students above the 50th NCE, and did you have an improvement in your NCE, the average NCE, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So the first two lines show that percent of students in the case of reading or math that are greater than the 50th NCE. The next line represents the average NCE, or the mean, and then the median being the value that is in the middle if we rank the students from the highest to the lowest. Then there'll be a count of students below that. The arrows represent how that value has changed from the displayed previous administration. As we mentioned with the performance index, for the fall report, this value will be from the previous fall. When you receive the winter version of this report, it will show fall to winter of the current year, and then in the spring it will represent the spring from the fall to the spring for the current year. On page 2 of the report, you will see what's called the quintile distribution. So the quintiles are merely all of your students divided up into 5 categories, with the lowest quintile be students that are in the 0 to the 19th percentile. So we're not using the NCE now, we're actually putting these students into percentile ranks. So the Higher Department of Education does the same thing when they look at students and value added with the quintile reports there. So we're dividing the students that you have into the same types of categories. As we said, the lowest quintile being 0 to 19th, 20 to 39th being the low middle group, 40 to 59th being that middle group, which in percentiles, those will be bunched considerably more around the 50th percentile. 60 to 79th percentile, and then the top group would be the 80th to the 100th percentile. So what we can look at here, again, is the distribution of our population from one administration of the test to the next. In the case of the fall administration, we are looking back 1 year. Now, with this particular group, we're not seeing much of a distribution change. And in some cases, they're the same. We're looking at math on the left. The top left would represent the current year, and then the one below would be math from the previous year. When you look at the winter version of this test, of course, like before, it will stay within the current year. It would be fall to winter and then fall to spring of the current year. But here we're looking at a particular makeup of our school for students and where they rank percentile-wise. This gives you a nice visual of the change. And as I mentioned, for this particular one, we don't see much of a change from one administration to the next. Page 3 of your report will give you a deeper dive into the distribution of your students based on the percent at or above the 50th NCE for both math and reading from the current administration, in this case back 1 full year to the previous year. So in this particular example, I see a grade 0, and grade 0 on these reports represents kindergarten. I see in kindergarten where we have a decent percentage, 67% of students are at the 50th or above NCE. 1 year prior, we had 86% of our kindergartners at that. Now, we can also do a little bit of a longitudinal look at this, and I see that using the kindergarten data from the year before, where we had 86% of our students at or above the 50th percentile, or NCE, it's easy to confuse sometimes, NCE, the current year, in this case 1920, 1 year later, we see that 63% of those students are at the 50th or above. If we use 50th as our measure of at grade level, we can see that we lost ground with reading scores for the kindergartners to first grade. Well, we can do the same thing across the board. For example, if we go back to the 18-19 year and look at second grade, we had 32.5% of the students at the 50th percentile. 1 year later, the third grade, when those conceivably are mostly the same students, that percentage goes up to 52.6. So this report it's one thing to compare this data from administration to administration, grade to grade, subject to subject, but we can also take this data and convert it or use it longitudinally to look and see how those students progressed from 1 year to the next. So that's probably the more powerful part of this report, is to look at the progression of a particular cohort of students in a particular subject. And finally, on the last page of the report is a detailed breakdown of the current administration. And reminder, we're back to projections from the fall to the spring. So all the performance index and past projections and so forth, those are all calculations based on a projection of where those students are expected to be by the spring. So again, we're looking at fall to spring. The next version of the report, the winter one, would say winter to spring projection. And then, of course, in the spring, it is the spring projection, which should be the most accurate version of all. So keep in mind that these are just projections, and it does not necessarily indicate what your performance index will be or the percent of students that are going to pass. These are simply calculations based on a calculation that NWEA has produced called the linkage report. So to start with this report, we'll look down through it. Obviously on the left is the subject and then the grade level that we're looking at. The number of students that are in each of these calculations by grade. And then we're looking at the mean or the average NCE by subject, math, reading, and then the average by each grade level. So we can look for areas that are struggling more or performing better than the others. And we can easily compare those from grade to grade and subject to subject. The median value tells me what that middle student is doing. If you think about it, if you look at a community and you look up the average home price might be $300,000 because there's a few high-end homes in a particular area, where the median might be a better reflection in a neighborhood that might say that the median house cost is maybe only $150,000 or some other number, because the numbers aren't skewed by some outliers. The past projection looks at the percent of students that are expected to be proficient, accelerated, or advanced. It's not necessarily based on that mean NCE, but more off the projected performance level. And then there's a breakdown of each performance level, the percent of students that are going to be limited, basic, proficient, accelerated, and advanced. With those calculations in hand, we can continue to convert it onto a projected performance index. Same as we saw on the first page, the projected performance index is color-coded based on the percent of the possible 120 points that that group has earned. And you can see, for example, in this case, 8th grade, 7th grade mathematics has a performance index of 54.6. Well, you needed to get 60 points in order to reach that 50% range that in the Higher Department of Education would count that as a D, or a pass, starting to pass that indicator if that was an indicator, which they do, but not this detailed. So that would be an area of greatest concern. And then we see some really positive numbers. We see the yellow, those are in the 70% or greater of the performance index possible points. So those are things to look at that are doing well, and we would want to concentrate a little bit more on, in this case, 7th grade mathematics. The same would be true if we have these reports from year to year. You can look for differences in their performance index from one year to the next. So that concludes the explanation of the norm reference test. If you have questions about performance index, want to take that in deeper, or maybe get a better understanding of that, how that is calculated, you can always reach out to me at snicol@buckeyehope.org. Thank you for watching.